Let's talk about the 6 Ds of exponential growth: digitization, deception, disruption, demonetization, dematerialization, democratization. Peter Diamandis presents them as a roadmap to abundance, a theory of how technology keeps reducing cost, expanding access, and transforming entire industries. It is one of the central myths of techno optimism, and to be fair to him, he gets close to something real, but he stops just before the conclusion his own framework demands. He has a useful way of illustrating exponential change. Take 30 linear steps, 1 meter each, and you travel 30 meters. Take 30 exponential steps, doubling each time, and you cover roughly 1 billion meters. That is the point of the analogy. Exponential systems look modest at first, but their growth compounds until the scale becomes impossible for established institutions to ignore. That part is real. But the 6 Ds do not describe the future success of capitalism. They describe a process that, if allowed to run to completion, would make capitalism obsolete. It starts with digitization. The moment something becomes information, it enters the domain of exponential growth. Music, photography, books, software, manufacturing blueprints, genetic data, design files, and entire knowledge systems can be copied, transmitted, and improved at near zero marginal cost. That changes the economics of whatever sector is being digitized, because information behaves differently from traditional industrial goods. Once the core value becomes code, data, or replicable design, scarcity begins to weaken. Then comes deception. Early on, the curve looks flat. Incumbents dismiss it. They laugh at early solar, early 3D printing, early digital fabrication, early automation, early synthetic biology. The shift looks slow until it doesn't. Exponential systems are accumulating their force at the beginning. That is why the old order keeps underestimating them. By the time the knee of the curve becomes obvious, the underlying economics have already started to change. Then comes disruption. This is the stage where industries start losing the form people once took for granted. A newspaper stops being a physical bundle of printed pages delivered to your door and becomes a stream of digital content, updated constantly and consumed piece by piece. A record store gives way to instant access, where owning the product matters less than accessing the song. Taxis stop operating primarily through local dispatch systems and street hills and instead get routed through apps that match riders and drivers in real time. Hotels face competition from platforms that turn spare rooms in private homes into bookable inventory. In each case, the old structure built around centralized capital, controlled distribution, and high material overhead starts to break apart because the new system can deliver the same basic function faster, cheaper, and with far less friction. Diamandis is still comfortable here because this is the stage capitalism can still narrate as innovation. The real problem begins at demonetization. Once goods and services become cheap enough to replicate, price starts collapsing. Search becomes free. Streaming becomes effectively free relative to physical media. Vast amounts of human knowledge become freely accessible. Software becomes open source. Design files circulate. Educational content scales globally at almost no cost. Diamandis celebrates this, and he should. But this is the point where the contradiction becomes unavoidable. If price keeps collapsing, what happens to profit? What happens to the market when the thing being sold no longer needs to be scarce in order to exist? This is also the point where capitalism intervenes. It does not actually allow the 60s to continue from demonetization into democratization. It interrupts the process and diverts it. The system cannot allow exponential abundance to reach its full social conclusion because that conclusion is the erosion of the market itself. So instead of letting demonetization keep dissolving price and ownership barriers, capital inserts subscriptions, licenses, service locks, access control, and platform dependency. It takes technologies that should be pushing ownership outward and reconfigures them as rental systems. That is why so much of modern life is structured around subscriptions. Netflix, Spotify, Microsoft Office, Adobe, cloud services, locked hardware ecosystems, software as a service, paid access to digital tools that could in many cases be owned outright or reproduced at minimal cost. This is not an accidental consumer trend. It is capital defending itself against the implications of abundance. Subscription is how the system simulates scarcity after actual scarcity has started to fail. If you own the tool, you do not need the company in the same way. If you own the file, the blueprint, the design system, the fabrication capacity, or the energy source, then the intermediary becomes less necessary. The entire logic of the current system depends on keeping people dependent. Not because dependency is natural, but because it is profitable. Capitalism works by forcing people to rely on institutions, platforms, and firms for access to things they could increasingly produce, replicate, or manage for themselves. But if distributed production continues advancing, more and more of what people currently have to buy could be made locally, copied freely, or generated on demand. That would mean less forced dependency, more material independence, and a world where ordinary people have far greater control over the conditions of their own lives. That is what capitalism is trying to prevent. It holds the process at demonetization and reroutes it into controlled access so demonetization never fully arrives. What follows from that diversion is a corrupted dematerialization, because under capitalism, dematerialization does not automatically mean liberation. A phone replaces a camera, a map, a stereo, a library, a television, a recorder, a scanner, a game console, and half an office. Fabrication tools shrink. Production tools become software. Machines begin doing what used to require whole buildings full of equipment. Dematerialization reduces cost, but inside a capitalist framework, it also becomes a tool of centralization. If the platform owns the software, the access layer, the cloud, the update system, and the licensing terms, then dematerialization does not distribute power. It concentrates it. The physical object disappears, but centralized control over the system becomes even tighter. That is why the story people tell about technology naturally producing democratization is too simple. The technology pushes toward lower cost and wider access, but the ownership structure determines what those gains mean. Under capital, dematerialization becomes a more efficient form of enclosure. The product gets smaller, cheaper, and more digital, while the user becomes more dependent on the company that controls the ecosystem. But the underlying technology does not care about the needs of capital. It keeps advancing anyway. It keeps cutting costs. It keeps shrinking the material and financial barriers to production. And if that process is ever allowed to reach completion, then the consequences are enormous. Once people can fabricate more of what they need locally, generate their own power, automate more production, recycle material inputs more efficiently, and access the means of production through distributed systems, the logic of buying and selling as the central structure of social life starts breaking down. If there is less and less reason to buy, then there is less and less to sell. And if the system can no longer organize life around sell and profit, it loses its organizing function. That is why abundance ends capitalism. Not because abundance is morally nicer, although it is, not because people will suddenly become saints. It ends capitalism because capitalism depends on keeping people in a condition of need. It needs access to be mediated, essentials to remain conditional, and too much of life to pass through a price tag. Real abundance weakens that hold. The more people can meet their needs without asking permission from the market, the less power capital has over everyday life. And once that power starts slipping, the system stops looking like a permanent structure and starts looking like what it really is, a temporary way of organizing scarcity. And that is the opening for something better. Once the tools of life are no longer locked behind scarcity, the real question becomes how to organize society around freedom, dignity, and human development instead of profit extraction. That is where Enlightenment socialism enters the picture. It does not fear the 6Ds. It takes them seriously enough to understand what they mean. If technology is making basic goods, services, knowledge, and productive capacity less scarce, then society should be reorganized around that fact instead of forcing artificial scarcity back into the system to preserve billionaires. So I would add a seventh D, dignity. Dignity is what abundance means when it is allowed to become social reality. It means basic needs are secure. It means coercion weakens because survival is no longer held hostage by the market. It means liberty starts becoming material. It means people are finally free to live rather than merely struggle for access. If this work is worth $2 or $4 to you, my Patreon is a tip jar. It helps me build a floor so I can keep doing this work.